folks, welcome back. I am better, as you can hear. Voice is no longer as scratchy and growly. Got a little bit of a video thing there. But I realized in watching the most recent video I did on the actual timeline. Now this is pushing 3 weeks ago now because I didn't have one last week. Video before that was really just a summation of how things were presented, such as the Salem witch trials and so on, and how that still can happen today. And we see it in Congress all the time with things like the Kavanaugh hearing. But I realized there's quite a bit that I kind of glossed over, and I want to go back over those things because they truly do deserve to be explained completely. Now, I will tell you, as I've said before, I'm approaching this the same as if I were in a class. Now, I am not giving you every single minuscule thing about every topic. The way I would teach in class is I would come up with basically, you can't see that very well, but an outline of my topic. So I would go through the chapter, and I would basically make my notes, and I would come up with an outline. I would then lecture from that outline. It was a combination of extemporaneous versus impromptu versus just me standing up and talking. And it's meant to foment discussion, to prompt questions. Because I don't want to be the Ben Stein character from Ferris Bueller where I put people to sleep and they simply write down everything I say so they can pass the test. I want to make the topic interesting. So I bring that to how I lecture. So I wanted to bring that up, and I am going to cover a few things today that I didn't cover as in depth as I believe I should have in that last video prior to the witch trials video. But looking at the lead up to war. Now we have basically a competition for one of the best industries in the colonies at the time, the fur trade, between the British and the French. Now, of course, they're going to seek out allies to help them, which would have been the Native Americans. And it really was them going to these Native Americans and saying, we're going to treat you better than the other side. Both sides said it. Probably neither side meant it. Neither one was in it for anything but money to be sent back to Europe. But the colonists needed something more than just trade. They needed security. Now, I alluded to the Albany Plan in that video. This is something that was drawn up by and introduced by Ben Franklin. In essence, it is the precursor to the federal government because it would have been the colonies banding together to raise money and pay for the creation of and the upkeep of a colonial militia. This would have been very different than any defense department today. Because you see, a militia is a civilian organization. It's why that word is used in the Second Amendment. Jefferson and the other founders very much accepted that a standing army can be corrupted. But when the people who are seeing their government try to subjugate them see this, they have a right and a duty to defend their rights and their liberties. So it was a militia. So this would not be building military bases and enlisting people and putting them in a uniform, issuing them weapons, training them in certain things. This is the militia. So it would have been for basically food and to pay maybe medical people to go with the militia if they had to be sent out. It was to support the group that was already in place. When the militia was called up, if it was me, I would be grabbing my rifle and my pistol and my ammunition and going with the others who were doing the same. I would probably bring some provisions of my own. Grab grab some water, a canteen or whatnot, and some bread or something. But the Albany Plan would have basically said, you're bringing yourself and your weapon and your knowledge. We're going to feed you, and we're going to find a way to have you have a place to sleep, and we're going to have someone there to keep you healthy. That's really all it was going to be. In essence, a MASH unit and a mess hall. Because the militia could never be a government-run organization. In fact, government officials who are currently serving in office cannot serve in a militia. They would need to resign their government office in order to take a part in the militia. Now, unfortunately, the Albany Plan failed. None of the colonies would cede their own autonomy to even a group of like-minded people from the colonies. So this is not ceding power to Britain. This is not bowing to Britain. This is the 13 colonies, all of whom are upset with Britain, could not agree to band together and have a body of people that were chosen by the colonies running this Albany Plan. It's pretty much what we see now with the arguing and infighting in D.C., where they can't even agree that water is wet and the sky is blue. Now, in 1753, George Washington, he's 21 years old. For those who can do the math, that adds another 23 years. So he was 44 years old when he was commanding the Continental Army. 44 for a general in charge of an entire army, pretty young. But he was 21 in 1753, and I saw this recently on the Chad Prather show. George Washington was not a military man. He was not law enforcement. He was not a leader of men in any way prior to being sent by the Continental Army. First, under the guise of the British for the French and Indian War, he was a surveyor. For those who don't know what that is, if you buy a plot of land, my parents did this a little over 10 years ago. We had to have a surveyor come out. And granted, now they're using laser levels and reflectors, but they determine the boundaries of your land. This is what Washington was doing prior to being sent as a young lieutenant to convince the French to leave. Now, of course, the French don't like the British. At the time, the colonies are British, so they don't like them either. So we had Fort Duquesne here, Duquesne. I'm not exactly sure to say that. I took Spanish in high school, promptly forgot it all. Took German in college, and I've forgotten most of it. Never took French. Just wasn't me. But Fort Duquesne, the French wouldn't leave, so Washington established Fort Necessity, very near to it. And in 1754, when the Redcoats showed up for the French and Indian War, Washington very wisely advocated what is recorded in the book, fighting Indian style. This is guerrilla warfare. For those who have never heard the term, it is guerrilla, not gorilla. Gorilla is the animal. Guerrilla, Guerrilla, manly do one. Spelling is not the strong suit. But guerrilla warfare is something the British had never faced. If you look at the battles even in the Revolutionary War, this is where you would see all of the troopers line up in rows, facing each other across the battlefield. They would both fire, and people would die. And it came down to which side could reload faster and kill everybody on the other side first. Very much where the term REMF, and I will let you ask your military friends what that means, but where that came from, because the people in charge issuing the orders, they were back far, far away from all the fighting. There was nothing to make them even nervous about the battles. The generals would watch as their men died. Whichever side had the most men left at the end of the war won. But Washington advocated a different style. This is where the U.S. military became the power it did. Because to fight guerrilla style, you would have some people fighting on their own. Small groups, without a commanding officer sent out to do something, trusted to lead themselves. There was none of this lining up in neat rows and seeing who has the most men left at the end. This is where people hide in trees. They set up snares and traps. They ambush you. They specifically go out to kill the generals. And Washington knew this worked. He'd faced this style of fighting before, and he knew it worked. If you've seen the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, there's a scene where Cornwallis and, I forget who the character's name was, but Cornwallis and Gibson's character are talking. And Cornwallis actually says that it's impolite and improper it's uncivilized to target the officers. And Gibson basically looks at him like, well, too bad for you. Leaves, ultimately takes Cornwallis' dogs with him. But this is where the colonists got this idea from. George Washington, 23 years before the Revolutionary War, had seen these tactics in action. In 1763, so I mean, we're 10 years out, really. The Treaty of Paris ultimately ceded all French territories west of the Mississippi and the Spanish territory of Florida to the British. This expanded the colonies exponentially, and ultimately would lead to Pontiac's Rebellion, which was in 1763 as well. This was Pontiac's people attacking forts and settlements until Pontiac was killed not long after the beginning of this rebellion, ultimately leading to his forces being defeated. Because at the time, and you could even say this to a point about the militia, the thought of a fighting force is that there is someone in charge. If there's not someone in charge, what are we here to do? This is the polar opposite of the modern military. And you can see it in militaries all over the world. You see it even in splinter cells like Al-Qaeda or Hamas, Hezbollah. If the person in charge is captured or killed, someone steps up. You've seen this in movies where you'll see an officer shot, and you'll see a young private grab the banner and yell, "Follow me," and charge into battle. That was very much what the colonists were trying to put into play, because they'd seen the tactics used against them to great success. They knew the British would never think to do this. If you took out the commanders of a unit, there was no one to yell, "Fire." And it would take half of their men being shot dead in front of them before any of them thought, well, I can fire on them without being told to fire. It's really sad. Honestly, it is. We get to the proclamation of 1763, though, which is George III issued the proclamations that the settlers could not live west of the Appalachians. Now, in part, and I've said this about many topics, I could argue both sides of this coin. I could argue for George's position. I could argue against it. Mostly because I was taught how to debate in high school and college, where you give me enough time and I can come up with enough good points on either side of an issue. But George III issued this proclamation. Much of it was to, one, prevent people being killed, because it was very much the Wild West when you get west of the Appalachians at the time. But it also limited the land available to the settlers. If it got crowded and you had people who wanted to emigrate to the colonies and there was nowhere for them to build a home, you had control of the colonies. And it was regularly ignored. Some colonists had already plotted land, had already taken and fenced in and started working and living on land west of the Appalachians. They were being told, you can't live on your own land at this point. And they said, tough. In the next couple of years, though, Britain's debt was not declining. You had the Sugar Act of 1764. This was, in essence, to minimize smuggling. In the Stamp Act of 1765, the Stamp Act basically requires that all paper goods have a stamp on them that proves you paid your tax. I've mentioned this series before, here and in other videos on the channel. Sleepy Hollow. It's available on Hulu. Tom Meissen and Nicole Beharie are the two prime characters, but you have other people as well. Orlando Jones is amazing, and it's not a comical role. But at one point, the Ichabod Crane character is just outraged at probably about a 9% sales tax on donuts. And he alludes to the fact that the revolution began over a 3% tax, which is basically the Stamp Act. Parliament would repeal the Stamp Act very quickly, but they then passed the Declaratory Act, which was a long-winded legalese way of saying, we are in charge, don't mess with us. This is, to the colonists, the equivalent of a bully saying, you can keep your lunch money today, but I'm still going to beat you up every day. And I'll take your money tomorrow. It did not go over well with the colonists. Neither of them did. And ultimately, this is where we see, had just a few things gone differently, had Britain not ruled exclusively, had they allowed some self-rule, the way they allowed their feudal lords to rule over their own land, and the lord would pay taxes. He would collect them from his people. Had they been more understanding, the revolution might have taken another 100 years to happen. We might have seen the Great Revolution of 1865 or 1860 to separate us from the British and end slavery. We might have seen two countries. Britain was very much ruling the colonies, the same as the king ruled over Britain, Scotland, and Ireland at the time. What the monarchy and Parliament did not realize is that distance allows for so much. In the UK, in Great Britain, they could have someone get from London, Edinburgh, Dublin, anywhere, in a matter of probably 2 days, 3 days max. Crying out loud, now you can get London to Edinburgh in 8 hours. So you think about it. If you can go 8 hours doing 60 miles an hour, that's 480 miles. If you average 5 miles an hour on a horse, say it's 100 hours. Well, that's 5 days. How long did it take to cross the Atlantic? Weeks. This distance, this physical separation from England allowed the colonists to really gear up, to be ready for the fight of their lives before Britain even had a standing army in the colonies. Franklin had been sent to France to court them as allies. The French still hated the British. Now that the colonies are going up against the British, France is on board. That was Gerard Depardieu's character in The Patriot. The French sent their people to the colonies not to fight, not necessarily, although they did, but to train the militia. The militia were very much what people would refer to as farmers and rednecks. But the French had seen the guerrilla tactics in the French-Indian War, and they listened to Washington, Adams, Franklin, Jefferson, and their militia counterparts. And while they did have some units that they would aid in fighting traditionally, they didn't stop them using guerrilla tactics. And that's where we're going to end this one. There's just a bit more in the run-up and the prep for the Revolutionary War. We're going to look at a few things. And then hopefully within the video after the next one, so 2 videos from now, we'll actually get into the timeline of the war. The timeline of the war is well known. We've seen it in movies and TV series, studies, history, lectures forever. But I do still want to go over it because it does show how the evolution of fighting from set-piece battles to guerrilla tactics changed the face of the planet when it comes to how battles are fought. Make sure you go on and subscribe, turn on notifications so you're aware of all new content. Class time videos do post at 10 o'clock Central Time on Wednesdays, but there will be other videos, as always. You'll want to make sure to go on and also like the video to let the algorithm know you like it, and share it to widen the conversation, widen the comment section. I do not ever want to make it sound like all the comments need to agree with me. I want disagreement. I want dissent. I want challenge. Because that is where we learn. But be civil. I challenged my teachers in high school. I challenged them in college. And I still challenge people I know are smarter than me today. But I am civil when I do it. Because that is me saying, here's what I have found. And it starts a conversation. And that conversation then prompts both sides to research and build their case, and so much more. And that is the beauty of it. So that's why I share. That way we can get that conversation going. Until next time, I am sorry for the audio-video issues. I am fairly certain I have mitigated those. I believe just looking at my screen, I don't believe there's much movement, so I am actually going to try and use the green screen again, but I can see some shadows. We'll see how that works out. We may just go with the green behind me until I can really bring up some better lighting, but who knows? I'm not going to let that stop me. The only thing that will stop a video posting is if I'm physically unable to do it, as last week was, where my allergies just hit me like a ton of bricks. And unfortunately, this time of year in Texas, it's likely to happen a time or two more before we get into the cooler weather. But I'm hoping to start getting some videos backlogged so that if I get a week where I'm down, I don't miss. And we'll see how that goes. Until next time, everybody have a wonderful